Welcome to Sleepless Historian, the place where medieval life isn't shouted through dates and battles but whispered softly like an old memory by the fire. Tonight we won't follow the path of kings or crusades, but the quiet footsteps of an ordinary woman, because sometimes a single life tells us more about the Middle Ages than 1,000 wars ever could. I was born in a village where winter was a punishment, hunger a companion, and hope a fragile ember we guarded like treasure. In a world where every misfortune was blamed on witches, I learned that survival itself could be mistaken for sorcery. But beneath the fear and superstition was something else: resilience, love, and the stubborn magic of simply paying attention. This is not the story of witchcraft, it's the story of courage, in a cruel season of compassion turned into heresy of medieval life, as it truly was, cold, raw, and astonishingly human. So let the night grow still. Let the world outside fade for a while. And if these quiet journeys through medieval life help you rest, breathe easier, or dream a little deeper, stay a while. There are many more stories waiting in the dark. Subscribe to Sleepless Historian and let history keep you company until sleep finds you. Childhood and the seeds of medicine. I learned early that survival was a kind of grammar, and my mother spoke it in whispers. By daylight we spoke the grammar of obedience, yes, father, yes, mother, yes, priest, knees pressed into cold stone eyes, lowered to dirt. But at night she shifted into the other language, the one that kept us alive. It began with hands wash them, even when water is a luxury. Warm them before touching a fevered child. Keep nails short so they would not catch on skin. Then came smells, the sourness that meant a wound was turning, the sharp pine that meant someone might yet be pulled back to the living. I pretended it was a game. I would point to a plant and ask its secret name. My mother would answer without moving her lips. Nettle for fever, plantain for bites, yarrow for bleeding, thyme for the cough that clawed a child's ribs. I whispered them until they became prayers no priest had taught me. When she caught me smiling, she pinched my ear and reminded me that prayers offered to the wrong listeners could turn into accusations. Faith was good, she said, but faith never boiled a kettle. The village noticed my eyes before they noticed my hands. Eyes that watched too closely were fox eyes, witch eyes. Decent girls were supposed to admire the mud. I learned to look down while listening up, to gather gossip like a sparrow gathers straw. Who was expecting a child who bled too long each month, whose husband limped home with wounds he swore came from a fall. People say witches see the future. We didn't. We saw the present too clearly. When I was 9, I watched my first birth. It happened in the corner of a byre, the air thick with animal breath and fear. The midwife's hands moved like she was untying a knot, turning the mother wrapping cloths, humming a tune like a church bell's low note. The baby came out blue as dusk. The midwife rubbed its feet, breathed into its mouth with a defiance that looked like tenderness. The child cried and everyone crossed themselves, praising saints who had not been in the room. I stood in the doorway and learned 2 dangerous truths. Life could be coaxed, and the credit would always go to whichever story people liked best. After that, I found reasons to pass the midwife's cottage, fetching water from a full bucket, returning bread that was never mine. She never invited me in, but she did not send me away. Once, she said, "You are the one with the sharp eyes. Be careful. Sharp eyes cut." I answered, "Dull eyes kill." She looked at me for a long time, then handed me dried leaves. My mother smelled them later, nodded, and told me to hide them under the hearthstone. That night, I slept with the certainty that a path had opened beneath me, whether the village liked it or not. Hunger never paused while I practiced. We bled goats into warm bowls, whisked the blood into milk pretending it was a feast. We scraped lichen from rock and called it seasoning. On the coldest mornings, bread was a weapon before food. You could chip a tooth on it, but hardship trained me in the anatomy of need. A farmer with a swollen hand did not want talk of demons. He wanted a poultice to pull heat from flesh. A widow with a cough did not want a sermon. She needed time, patience, and the comfort of a warm cup. I kept count of my failures. It would be pretty to say each failure taught as much as success, but that is poetry. Failure taught grief and fury and the habit of staring at the sky for no reason but to blame it. Still, I learned. I learned the moment when fever eases its heat-flattening breath, loosening like a string undone. I learned the sound of shallow panting that meant a child was leaving, and I learned to keep my voice steady so the mother would not hear it too. In those moments, I spoke softly of watercloths, fresh air, small instructions that felt like love when you could do nothing greater. Evenings after the animals were settled and the light thinned to grey, my father tested me. Not openly, he was a good man, taught to be afraid of clever daughters, but with stories disguised as warnings. Old Marta's calf went lame yesterday, he would say, carving bread as if it were gold. Best not to meddle. These things have their own cures. I would nod silent. Later, my mother would send me with a jar and a cloth, a sentence that sounded like a blessing, but was really permission. If there was a religion in our cottage, it was the religion of touch. Hands on a brow, hands around a cup, hands gripping the bed when someone slipped into pain. My mother taught me to keep fear out of my fingers. Fear makes you heavy, heavy hands bruise. I practiced until I could rest 2 fingers on a pulse as lightly as a moth. When a woman once took my wrist and told me to stay while the midwife fetched cloths, I felt a pride so fierce it frightened me. Pride is another thing that can get a girl burned. The priest was generous with suspicion. He preached against women who knew too much, which meant women who knew anything. He said the devil hid inside good deeds like wolves in snow. I learned to bow at the right moments, to let my face be simple, as if simplicity were a virtue and not a veil. The disguise worked until it didn't, because disguises always end. There were days I wished for ignorance, the kind that let you pass a dying house without pausing. But once you know the sounds, you cannot unknow them. You hear the wheeze of drowning lungs, the cough rattling winter into bone, the way a mother says please when she has no words left. Then you turn in at the gate, because not turning feels worse than sin. Yet some nights I walked on fists tight in my apron, so I would not knock. Better guilt than accusation, I told myself. But each time I hated myself a little more. My mother said, death was patient, but neighbours were not. The moment a child coughed too loud, rumours began a shadow, seen at the door, a muttered word, mistaken for a curse, a glance too sharp at the wrong harvest. Suddenly, someone whispered a witch had been near. You could not cough without becoming evidence, and you could not save a life without people asking whose power you had borrowed. At 10, I sat beside my first deathbed, my cousin's. His body burned, his eyes rolled white, his breath came in ragged pulls. I pressed cool cloths, whispered church prayers and secret ones. He died anyway. The priest called it God's will. I called it failure. In the end, we were both right. The village did not blame me, but I blamed myself. I replayed every step, every herb, searching for the moment I might have turned his fate. What I learned was not a cure, but a limit. I could coax life, not command it. Sometimes coaxing failed. Still I kept coaxing because not trying was worse. The seasons folded over us. Winters starved us, springs drowned us, summers scorched us, autumns teased us, with harvests too small to last. Through it all I practiced. I sharpened my ears for the rattles, and gasps my eyes for rashes spreading, like ivy joints swollen skin yellowing. Each sign was a syllable in a language I was desperate to master. One day, a farmer brought his bleeding son. The boy had cut his leg on a rusted tool trousers soaked. The father muttered about curses, even as he begged for help. I washed the wound, packed it with boiled moss, bound it. For days I changed the poultice, watching the flesh knit itself shyly together. When he walked again, I felt a joy sharper than hunger. I had pulled him back, but the story told in the village was not about moss. It was about my humming, my whispered nonsense, which someone thought sounded strange. She whispered to the devil, one said. No, another argued to angels. Truth that I whispered nonsense to steady my hands was never invited to supper. Gossip always ate first. Still, people kept coming. A child with fever, a woman bleeding after birth, a man with rashes clawing his skin raw. They came secretly with excuses. Ready, I was just passing by, or she happened to be there when I needed water. They lied as if I were a lover, not a healer. Perhaps that saved me for a time. They needed me too much to condemn me. Each case taught me more than sermons. Willow bark dulled pain but angered the stomach. Honey sealed wounds better than cloth. A warm stone on the belly eased cramps. Breathing slowly kept a fainting woman tethered to her body. Always I learned to keep my voice gentle, because mistakes are forgiven more easily than arrogance. But envy I could not cure. Women watched me with narrowed eyes, fearing I took what belonged to them. I did not blame them. In a place where survival was rationed, even gratitude felt like theft. Still I feared them. A neighbour's suspicion could become a priest's sermon, and a sermon could become a trial. My mother warned, do not shine too brightly. Fire draws eyes. In this village, eyes burn. The midwife began to tolerate me. She let me carry water, press my hands on bellies to feel muscles strain. Her cottage smelled of smoke and lavender herbs hanging from rafters. She named each bleeding milk rot poison. She spoke like a soldier, listing weapons, and in truth that was what she was. Her battlefield was the body. There I learned the truth. No priest admitted women held the real keys to life. Men wrote laws, swung swords, thundered sermons. But women delivered babies, closed wounds, brewed broths. Because of this, women were feared. Knowledge in female hands was witchcraft. Men could brew ale all day, and no one cried alchemy, but if a woman boiled nettle for fever, sinful, demonic, dangerous. When I returned home with scraps of knowledge, I held them like coins I dared not spend. My father sensed the change before anyone else. He looked at me once squinting and said, only careful. Careful with words, with cures, with neighbours' eyes. I promised I would be careful. I lied. Because once you have touched life at its most fragile, you cannot return to ignorance. I had felt pulses vanish and return. I had heard silence after stillbirth and wild relief when a baby wailed. Those sounds branded me deeper than sermons. How could I forget them? How could I walk away? I practiced more openly at home. My mother permitted it. We brewed teas for my father's joints, cured my brother's cough with honey and thyme, lanced a neighbour's swollen hand. Each small victory made me bolder. Boldness is a dangerous luxury in a place where humility passes for holiness. One night, a neighbour's child seized violently. The priest had come sprinkling holy water, leaving only despair. They begged us. I went. The boy's body jerked, lips foaming. I pressed cloths, dropped valerian into his mouth, whispered not to saints, but to whatever spark tethered him. Hours crawled. Then the seizing stilled. He breathed deep. He slept. His mother called me her saviour. By morning she called me her risk. She begged me never to speak of it. So my life became a dance. Called in desperation, dismissed in daylight. Needed in shadows, denied in public. They wanted my hands, not my name, my remedies, not my presence. Shield and scapegoat, depending on whether a patient lived. It would have been comical if it were not so cruel. Still I clung to hope. Maybe when I was older, when my skill undeniable, they would accept me. That foolish hope was bread to my famine. But a part of me already knew, in a world that feared women with sharp eyes, no proof was proof enough. By 11, I learned the sound of secrecy, the hush in a mother's voice when her baby had not fed the scrape of shoes on the path at night. The silence at church when eyes turned away too quickly. I carried those sounds like another language. The priest's sermons bent toward fear temptation in the fields, devils, in forests, witches who cursed the soil. His eyes lingered when he condemned women who stole power meant for men. I felt those words like ash on my skin. Yet the same women he damned kept children alive through winters. But priests were trained to know, not to admit. At home I grew restless. I wanted books locked in monasteries, wanted to read what scholars in Italy, France, Arabia wrote. But books were chained guarded, written in Latin. So I fed myself on travellers' tales, scraps of cures. Most were nonsense, some worked. All felt like doors, even if locked. One door stayed open, my own certainty. Certainty that my hands were not clumsy, that my heart did not falter. Once, a man stumbled into our yard with his face split open. Everyone else turned away. I pressed cloth to the wound, steadied him. He lived his scar-proof of my hands. But gratitude never lasted as long as suspicion. Whispers grew, my eyes lingered too long, my hands too confident. No child so young should know so much. I laughed bitterly. If a man tended wounds, he was wise. If I did, I was wicked. If a man survived winter hardy, if I did, unnatural. Hypocrisy is almost funny, except it kills. My mother tried to shield me. She told me to act slow, play simple. I tried, but ignorance wore badly on me. And when someone begged at our door, I could not say, I don't know. So I answered. Each answer tightened the rope around my neck. One night, after I helped a woman through a miscarriage, I asked my mother if she regretted teaching me. Her hands trembled by the fire. Every day, she whispered. But not because you are unworthy, because the world is. I never forgot those words. By year's end, I had a reputation, both shield and sword. Children ran to me with scraped knees. Women sent for me in pain. Men came in secret when pride allowed. I was needed. And yet, I was watched. Each kindness was another stone on the scales. But the scales never balanced, they only tipped sooner or later. This was my childhood hunger, gnawed my bones. Whispers gnawed my name. Knowledge grew in me like a tree planted in the wrong soil. The roots spread deeper with every season, though I felt the ground turning against me. I could not stop. To stop would betray every child I had seen, buried every mother I had seen weep. I told myself that one day they would see, they would understand. I clung to that hope. And that is how I entered my 12th year, not child, not yet woman, but something dangerous between. A girl with too much knowledge, too much fire in her eyes, too stubborn to bow. A girl who had already learned the lesson that would one day consume her in our world it was never enough to heal. To heal was to risk everything. The Aunt and the Secrets of Midwives. When I look back on the moment my path widened beyond the walls of my family's cottage, I see the crooked roof of my aunt's house in Albinon. It leaned like a weary shoulder against the mountain, as if the stones themselves had grown tired of carrying so many secrets. The villagers treated it like a cursed place, crossing themselves as they walked past, whispering that demons nested in the rafters. But to me, it was the first place that smelled like possibility smoke, lavender-dried nettle and iron. My parents had resisted sending me there. My father said it was dangerous to let a child linger near women with reputations. My mother said much the same, but with softer eyes, because she knew the temptation of knowledge, as well as the risk. But I begged again and again, wearing down their refusals the way rain wears down stone. At last they agreed, and one morning with a glance over her shoulder, as if the church tower were watching, my mother told me to go. "Learn what you can," she whispered, "and guard it like a wound." Albinon was only a day's walk, but it felt like crossing into another country. The valley narrowed, the houses pressed together, and the air grew dense with suspicion. People saw me with my bundle and asked where I was going. When I mentioned my aunt's name, their mouths tightened. Some would not even point me in the right direction. It was as though the very act of giving directions might summon the devil himself. By the time I reached her door, I already knew what they thought of her. What I found inside was nothing like their stories. My aunt was not a bent crone with blackened teeth. She was a woman with calm eyes, quick hands, and a voice that carried the weight of both scolding and comfort. She wore a cross around her neck and went to Mass every Sunday, and the only blood on her hands was the blood of childbirth. The villagers whispered of Sabbaths and sacrifices, but in her home the only rituals were those of survival, boiling water, binding wounds, easing pain. She did not welcome me warmly at first. She looked me over with a gaze that seemed to measure how much trouble I was likely to cause. "You are the one with the sharp eyes," she said finally. Sharp eyes cut. "Do you have hands to mend as well as eyes to see?" I said I did not know. She shrugged. "Then we will find out." The apprenticeship began without ceremony. She handed me bundles of herbs, ordered me to hang them from the rafters, and expected me to remember their names. Chamomile for calm, sage for cleansing, yarrow again for bleeding, because no one ever seemed to bleed politely in one place. She corrected me briskly when I confused them, and, when I asked too many questions, she silenced me with a glance. "The body has its own language," she said. "Learn it first. Your questions will catch up." I learned quickly that being a midwife was less about miracles and more about labour, scrubbing floors, boiling cloths, carrying buckets, grinding leaves, until my arms ached. Yet within these chores lay knowledge. The way chamomile dust stung your eyes meant it was strong enough to sting away fever. The way nettle pricked your skin, even when dried, meant it could still wake a sluggish body. Every task was a lesson disguised as drudgery. Sometimes women came in desperate secrecy, bellies, swollen eyes darting. My aunt closed the shutters, lit candles, and worked with a calm that seemed to hold the whole room steady. I was told to stand in corners, to hold water, to press cloths. I watched her hands disappear beneath skirts and reappear stained with sweat blood and sometimes tears. She never flinched. "Life is messy," she said once, as though I needed reminding. "Death is too. Learn to touch both without trembling." The first time I helped, truly helped, was not heroic. It was simple, holding a basin, while a woman laboured, her sweat dripping into the water, her nails cutting crescents into my arm as she clutched me. I whispered nonsense to steady her words that meant nothing but sounded like prayer. When the child slipped into the world and wailed, she sobbed into my shoulder. For a moment, I thought I had been blessed. But the next day, she passed me in the street, without looking as though my presence shamed her. That was the rhythm I would come to know, needed in the night, avoided in the morning. I learned more than herbs. I learned the sounds of a body unravelling, the sharp cry when bones shifted wrong, the hollow gasp of blood loss, the silence of a womb that had turned traitor. My aunt did not shield me from any of it. She said, "If you are to learn, learn the whole truth. Half knowledge kills." And so I watched even when it broke me, because to look away felt worse than cruelty. Fear too was part of the education. My aunt taught me how to keep quiet. She warned me never to repeat what I saw, never to boast, never to let pride sharpen my tongue. "The world does not love women who know too much," she said, "and it hates those who admit it." She told me of midwives accused after a stillbirth, dragged before priests, forced to confess to crimes they had never imagined. "Every baby that dies is an arrow in our backs," she said. "Every wound that festers, every fever that lingers. People need someone to blame, and we are always convenient." Her stories lodged in me like splinters. I began to notice how quickly gratitude turned to suspicion. A woman who blessed us with tears after a safe delivery might avoid our eyes in the marketplace the next week. A man whose wife recovered under my aunt's care might mutter in church that too much skill smelled of sorcery. I understood then why my aunt lived at the edge of the village. It was not the devil who kept her apart, but the fear of her neighbours. One night, after a particularly hard winter birth where the child did not live, my aunt sat by the fire and spoke without looking at me. "You must understand, child, that we are guilty before we even begin. Guilty of knowing too much, guilty of surviving, guilty of being women." Her voice was flat, but her eyes gleamed wet in the firelight. Still, I could not stop learning. I memorized recipes as if they were prayer's honey to seal wounds, willow bark for pain, valerian for sleep. I learned that warmth could coax a failing pulse, that clean water was worth more than any relic, that the difference between cure and poison was sometimes no more than a pinch too much. My aunt tested me sometimes cruelly. She would thrust 2 plants into my hands and demand I name them in the dark. She would wake me in the night and order me to prepare a tincture before my eyes were fully open. "The body does not wait for your convenience," she said. "Neither will sickness." The cruelest lesson came with success. One winter evening, a woman arrived, shrieking her baby tangled inside her. The room spun with heat-sweat blood. I held water-fetched cloths, pressed my hand to the mother's forehead as she screamed curses at saints and devils alike. Hours passed. At last the baby came limp and silent. I thought it was death, but my aunt slapped its back, breathed into its mouth, worked with a fury that seemed like defiance. The child gasped, then wailed. The room filled with relief so thick it nearly drowned me. But the next day I heard whispers in the village that the midwife had called upon forbidden spirits, that no ordinary woman could pull a child back from the brink. Gratitude had already soured into suspicion. That was when I realized the cruelest truth of all success was as dangerous as failure. A death brought accusations, yes, but a life could bring them too. If you failed, you were cursed. If you succeeded, you were suspected. The line between healer and witch was drawn not by truth, but by fear. And fear was a sharper knife than any herb could mend. I stayed in Albanon for months, learning by day, listening by night. My aunt told me stories of women before us, women who had written their knowledge in books, now chained in monasteries, women whose names had been erased by fire. She spoke of Hildegard, who wrote of plants and their virtues, and of Avicenna, whose words had travelled from Arabia to Europe, only to be locked behind Latin. No woman was allowed to read. The knowledge exists, my aunt said, but not for us. So we build our own libraries in our heads, and we guard them with silence. I carried her words back to bed each night, repeating them like litany. Silence was safety. But I was young, and silence sat badly on me. My tongue itched to tell someone what I knew, to share the marvel that nettles could soothe fever, that honey could keep flesh from rotting. But each time I opened my mouth, I remembered my aunt's face, the flatness of her voice, when she said, "Guard it like a wound." So I swallowed my knowledge, tasting it like blood on the back of my tongue. The longer I stayed, the more the village watched. Children ran when they saw me coming. Women muttered that I looked too closely, listened too sharply. Men laughed nervously and then crossed themselves. I learned the sound of suspicion, the hush that followed me like a second shadow. And yet when fevers came, they still knocked at our door. Need was stronger than fear, though fear always returned once the danger passed. Not every night was heavy with death. Some evenings, when work was done, my aunt let me sit beside her while she prepared ointments. She told me about plants as though they were people, some honest, some sly, some generous, some cruel. Wormwood will ease pain, she said, but it takes more than it gives if you are greedy. She placed a sprig under my nose. Smell it so you remember. Plants have voices. Learn to listen. I inhaled, and the bitterness stung my throat. I coughed, and she laughed softly. It was the only time I heard her laugh that winter. Once she let me taste foxglove leaves, just the smallest edge to know the bitterness. "Enough to remind you that knowledge is dangerous," she said. I spat, shuddering. "That plant can save a heart," she explained, "or stop it. The choice is in the dose. Remember that. The difference between a healer and a murderer is often a pinch. One night a knock came after midnight. A man stood outside, cradling his wife, whose belly twisted with labour pains too early. My aunt dragged them in without hesitation. For hours we worked the woman, screaming, bleeding, slipping in and out of consciousness. I pressed her thighs, fetched boiling water, held her head as my aunt fought to keep her tethered. By dawn, the child was gone. The woman barely clung to life. We saved her, but her grief was a wound deeper than any I could bind. The man looked at us with eyes full of both gratitude and blame. Later, he told neighbours my aunt had cursed his wife. In the church that Sunday, the priest nodded knowingly, and I understood again that survival came with no guarantee of safety. But not every story ended in tragedy. Once I watched my aunt set a broken leg. She pulled, twisted, set the bone with a snap that made me bite my own tongue. The boy screamed, then fainted. Weeks later, he was walking again, limping but alive. The villagers praised God for the miracle, though no miracle had sat in that room, only skill and stubbornness. The boy's mother brought us bread, then crossed herself as she left. Gratitude always wrapped in suspicion. By the time spring came, I was no longer a child sneaking questions in the dark. I was an apprentice, though no priest or scholar would admit it. I could recognize plants by touch, by smell, by the way they cracked in fire. I could prepare poultices, teas, tinctures. I could steady a woman in labour and not flinch when her screams broke the rafters. I was still clumsy, still frightened, but I was no longer ignorant. And ignorance in our world was the only innocence allowed. When I finally returned home to Ershmat, my bundle heavier than when I left my mother saw the change instantly. She searched my eyes and found too much fire. My father squinted and said only one word: careful. I promised him I would be careful. But I had already learned the midwife's secret: careful was never enough. Growing up and the desire to save lives. When I came down from Albanon, the mountain still smelled of smoke and snow, and my hair still held the scent of lavender from my aunt's rafters. I thought I could step back into the old rooms of my life, as if nothing had shifted, as if the winter light would catch me in the same corner where I used to sit and sew crooked seams. But the village had learned a new word for me while I was gone, and even the goats looked up when I passed, as if trying to remember whether I had always walked with my shoulders squared like that. My mother kissed my forehead and then stood back to study me the way she used to study a fever, quietly searching for the turn. My father did not come close. He squinted as if the air around me had thickened. Careful, he said the word he always chose, when he wanted to say 100 others. I promised I would be, and meant it for the length of a single breath. They kept me busy at first, the village, and my family both pretending I had returned unchanged. I fetched water until the handle of the bucket made a red groove in my fingers. I fed the fire and scraped the pot and mended a torn sleeve that would never sit right again, but at the well the women's voices lowered when I drew near. In church, the priest's eyes wandered over the congregation and paused on me the way a hand pauses over a hot pan. I learnt again how to look at the floor, how to let my mouth be soft and my gaze dull. It is amazing what people will say out loud if they are certain you are not clever enough to understand. Marriage came up as naturally as mildew. A neighbour told my mother she knew a man of steady habits who would be grateful for a wife who kept to herself. Another offered a cousin with a small strip of land and a temper like sour wine. A husband will protect her, they said, as if a ring were a shield and not a leash. I smiled the way obedient girls smile, and felt my hands itch to be anywhere else. I had watched women roar life into the world, and then be told to keep their voices down. I could not imagine changing my name for a man who did not know nettle from yarrow, so I started saying yes to the knocks that came after sunset. I said yes to the old man who split his palm on a frozen gate latch. Yes to the child who coughed until his ribs rattled like dice. Yes to the woman whose monthly bleeding would not stop and who pressed my fingers to her wrist like a drowning person clutching driftwood. I boiled water until the steam turned the windows opalescent and my hair curled at the temples. I brewed thyme when the coughs were wet, and nettle when the fevers ran hot, and honey when the flesh around a wound needed something to remind it how to knit. I worked with the ordinary ferocity of a person who understands that small things done on time keep the large, terrible things at bay. The first patient I saw after my return was a boy who had opened his leg on a rusty hook in the barn. He came limping with his father, trousers wet and dark. The father's mouth kept shifting between a curse and a prayer. "It will rot," he said. "It will rot for sure." I washed the cut with boiled water and vinegar while the boy hissed through his teeth. The smell made my own eyes water. I packed the wound with moss that we had boiled and cooled and bound it snug. When I finished, the boy's face had turned the colour of cheese, but his breathing had smoothed. "Come back tomorrow," I said. The father nodded and then did not return for 3 days, because men like him believed wounds closed faster when ignored. When they came back, the edges had glued themselves like shy lips. I changed the poultice, checked for heat, told the boy to keep the bandage dry, which meant telling him to stay out of every muddy thing that wanted him. When he walked without a limp a week later, he grinned at me in a way that made me feel suddenly foolish and oddly proud. At church, his mother thanked the saints loudly, and me not at all. I preferred it that way. Let saints serve as shields. I had no desire to stand up front where the priest might aim. That winter, a fever moved through the valley, like a thief who knew where we kept our treasures. It took milk from women and breath from children and slept in the lungs of old men. I went from house to house with my apron, weighing me down like a second body. In each house I left a little heat behind a cup, a compress, a line of instruction, the way a captain leaves a course for those who can still sail. Strip the child and rub him with vinegar. Keep the room aired, though your mother will tell you to shut every window. Boil the water until you are tired of watching it, and then boil it again. The mother's hands shook when they took the cups from me. The grandmothers tutted and said my methods were unusual. When the fevers broke, wails gave way to sleep, and sleep to hunger, which is the sweet sound of a body returning to itself. But not every house released the fever. In one, a boy with hair the colour of wheat refused to breathe in any way that looked like a future. I sat beside him as the afternoon failed and the fire gasped and then finally caught. I laid cloths and changed cloths and listened for a turn that did not come. At last, the small, terrible silence settled, the one even the dogs will not bark at. His mother rocketed forward with him, in her arms, emotion older than speech. I could not help thinking of all the old stories about devils and bargains, and how very tidy those stories are compared to the truth, which does not bargain and does not explain. I walked home under a sky that looked like iron, and washed my hands until the skin burned. The priest preached harder after that. He thundered about hidden sins and the women who invited them into the village. He said the devil's favourite trick was to heal, because gratitude makes for easy prey. People nodded, because nodding requires no proof. A woman threw me a look in the market that slid like a blade across my cheek. The same woman sent her daughter to my door that night with a note folded 3 times asking for something to ease a pain that had kept her from sleeping for 3 nights. I mixed valerian with a drizzle of wine and wrapped it in cloth, as if wrapping a secret. The girl thanked me with her eyes and said nothing with her mouth, which is the language most of us used when we wanted to live. An old neighbour, Marta, sent for me in a rush one morning. Her sister had fallen in the yard and split the skin above her brow. There was so much blood on her face, you would have thought the wound mortal, but heads love drama. They bleed like widows. I boiled a needle, threaded it with linen, unspooled from a hem, and cinched the skin together in quick, neat bites, while Marta swore she would faint, and never did. You must be careful, Marta said afterward, when her bravado had returned. You are becoming too good. I laughed in the way people laugh when they have been warned about the cliff at the end of the road and decide to walk faster. Marriage offers hardened into advice spoken through the teeth. My father insisted we receive a man named Ulrich who had 3 goats, 2 good boots, and a habit of staring at my wrists. He told a story about his cousin's wife who had bled in childbirth until a midwife did something. He was not sure what. He did not care to know. Women's business, he said, and grinned as if he had said something witty. When he left, my mother looked at me across the table as though I were already walking away. You do not have to marry him, she said, but you do have to survive. I answered that sometimes the two are the same thing. To survive, I learnt to make my work smaller in daylight and larger at night. I let men carry the stories in public and let women carry them in private. I accepted loaves of bread as currency wheels of cheese, the softest thing of all, a quiet hand squeeze at the door. I stopped correcting those who credited saints for my work. I stopped meeting the priest's eyes. I let gratitude pass through me as if I were a sieve. The thing is to keep moving. Water that rests will freeze. There was a night when the snow fell the way ash falls slow, unhurried, certain. A woman sent her husband to fetch me, and he banged on our door like he meant to disprove it. Inside their house, the air seemed to stand still. The woman's labour had stuck. The child would not turn. The midwife had been called, but she had not arrived. I washed my hands in water, so hot it made my skin howl, and then slid them under the sheet. I could feel the baby's stubborn head, and the mother's stubborn body, and the hours that would not pass. Breathe with me, I told her, and we breathed as if I could put my lungs into hers by force. When the midwife arrived, she found the two of us locked together like combatants who had somehow fallen in love. The baby came soon, after a furious little animal outraged to find that the world existed. The mother laughed on a sob the way women laugh when they have nothing left in them to do either separately. The next morning the story had already begun to walk around without me. Some said the midwife saved the child. Some said I had whispered in a language not heard in the church. A man told another man that he saw a shadow move where no candle was lit. The midwife thanked me with her eyes when we passed at the well, and then put her back to me in case anyone was watching. I wanted to be angry, and found that I was only tired. In the spring, I planted a small bed of herbs behind our house, tucked close to the wall, so the wind would not bully them. I put thyme near the warm stones and yarrow, where the runoff would find it, and chamomile, where I could brush it with my skirt and catch the scent. When the shoots rose shy, and certain I felt a happiness I did not dare take into my mouth. The neighbours pretended not to notice. Children came to pull leaves when their mothers were not looking. I let them, telling myself that anyone who learns a plant by taste will remember it longer than by lecture. Once a blacksmith burned his forearm through the leather of his apron. The skin blistered into a single painful eye. He came at dusk with his arm held like an accusation. I cooled the burn in water, then spread goose fat and honey, in a glistening, ridiculous layer that made him scoff. Sweetness for a wound, he said. Why not a prayer and a pie, while you are at it? I told him to come back the next day, if he wanted to keep the arm he hit metal with. He returned quieter. The honey had turned the angriest red to the honest pink of healing. Do not tell anyone, he muttered. I promised nothing, and told no one. The scar that later made a pale river down his forearm told our secret for us. I learned to listen to houses as if they were bodies. You can tell what is going on by the smell at the threshold, the sound of pots, the way a curtain moves or does not move when someone in the next room breathes. I learned to step sideways to make myself smaller. I learned to be a no one that the sick would allow close. I learned the art of leaving before a thank you could turn to a question, the art of slipping into alleys, so the priest did not have to decide whether to greet me. One evening, after I had helped a woman through a pain that came like tides and left her with nothing but emptiness, I sat with my mother in the blue hour when the world forgets to be hard. She turned my hands over as if reading them. Do you regret learning? She asked. I said that regret is for those who have time to cultivate it. She laughed the way people laugh when they do not wish to cry. There will come a day, she said, when all this kindness will be counted against you. I told her I knew. Knowing does not change a thing. It merely removes the surprise. By the time the first wildflowers came up in the ditch, I had stopped thinking of myself as a girl who might someday become a healer. I was one the way a door is, a door whether anyone walks through it or not. The village did not officially acknowledge this. They never would. Officially, I was a daughter of a small house with a small garden and a talent for making myself useful. Unofficially, the path to our door grew deeper each night. The ground keeps the secrets of the feet that cross it, but if you know how to read the earth, you can see how many have come and how many will come again. In quiet moments I wondered what it would be like to live in a place where knowledge did not require camouflage. To stand in a room with a book and say a name other than mine, Hildegard perhaps, and be allowed to repeat her words aloud. To walk into a church without feeling a sermon rise like smoke around me. Then someone's child would cry out in the lane, or a woman would knock with blood on her hem. and I would stop wondering and go, that was the rhythm of those years, the steady thrum of small salvations, the sudden plunge of losses. No one could afford the slow turn of seasons that brought both back around. I grew older without noticing, taller in the mirror of the well, narrower in the mirror of other people's patience. The word witch had not been thrown at me yet, not to my face. It hovered, though, the way a storm hovers just beyond a ridge. You can taste such storms before you can name them. Iron on the tongue, a pressure behind the eyes, the sense that the air itself is deciding whether to break. I kept moving. I boiled water. I cut threads. I brewed bitter teas and sweetened them when I could. I sang nonsense when my hands needed rhythm. I learned which neighbours' windows I could tap softly at, and which doors I should never admit to having entered. I slept when I could, and when I could not, watched the edge of the sky for the first hint of grey, that merciful colour that says you have outlived another night. People ask in the safety of hindsight why I did not run, as if there were a place a woman like me could run to and not be found by the same fear in a different hat. As if knowledge does not carry its own price wherever you go? The answer is simple. I stayed because there were bodies that needed me, and rooms that breathed easier when I entered them. I stayed because life was stubborn, and I was stubborn too. I stayed because choosing to do good in a place that mistrusts goodness is its own quiet rebellion. And rebellions sometimes need to be small to survive. If I had known how much it would cost, would I have chosen differently? Perhaps I would have paused longer on certain thresholds. Perhaps I would have stitched my words shut on certain days. But when I imagine my hands empty, idle, obedient, I cannot make the picture hold. The world has always been heavy. The only question is which weight you prefer to carry, fear or meaning. I chose meaning again and again, even when it tasted like iron. Tragedy and accusation. They came for me at dusk, when the world turns the colour of old iron, and even healthy houses sound tired. Snow was still clinging to the edges of roofs, the kind that remembers winter long after everyone else pretends it is gone. A boy pounded on our door, with the flat of his hand, breath white in the air. "Come," he said, and could not say the rest. He didn't have to. The shape of his fear told me everything. A woman labouring a labour that would not give. I grabbed my basket, the one that always seems both too heavy and too light, and followed him into the evening. Inside the cottage, the air had the close, sour smell of long pain. A fire glowed, but gave no comfort. The mother lay on the bed, with her knees drawn up, hair pasted to her face, lips bitten until they bled. A sister held her hand, and prayed out loud, as if volume could pry heaven open. A cousin hovered with a bowl, useless as a fence post in a flood. I washed my hands in water so hot it made my skin sting, then slid them beneath the sheet. The child was turned wrong stubbornly, as if the world had already offended it. I felt for the soft spot, the line of spine, the cord that should have been a lifeline and sometimes is a noose. "Breathe with me," I told her, and matched my breath to hers until the rhythm steadied. I coaxed with my fingertips, the way one coaxes, a knotted thread patient firm, refusing to let panic borrow my hands. The room shrank to the points where skin met, skin my palms, her belly the child's skull, beneath tissue-thin walls. Outside, someone was chopping wood in a hurry that solved nothing. Prayer beads clicked like beetles. Snow ticked in the chimney. I found the cord and slipped a finger under it, slid it carefully, knowing that all the care in the world is sometimes only a way of being present for loss. Hours bent, the fire fell, and someone fed it. The mother drifted off the edge of herself and clawed her way back on my voice. The child would not turn, then turned, then faltered, as if it could not remember how to enter a place it had never been. When at last the baby came, it came silent, a seal pulled from dark water. I rubbed its back, felt nothing but the faintest yielding. I breathed into that small mouth again and again the way you breathe on a spark you know is only ash pretending. My hands worked, my heart begged, the air remained air. Across the room the sister stopped praying and began to bargain naming saints I had never met as if they were cousins who could be shamed into visiting. I kept at it because stopping is sometimes indistinguishable from giving up, and I wanted the difference. The baby's skin carried that impossible blue that does not belong to any sky I know. Its lips did not part for the world. At last I set it aside with a gentleness that has no other use. I turned back to the mother and saw she had begun to bleed in earnest, the kind of bleeding that is not dramatic so much as decisive. We changed rags until the pile looked like a butcher's apron. I pressed and bound and lifted her hips. I brewed yarrow and begged her body to remember its own doors and close them. For a moment the flow slowed, and I let myself believe, which is a kind of inattention I do not forgive in myself. Then it surged again, a river, remembering it was a river. The mother's eyes found mine wide, lucid, grateful apologizing for something that wasn't hers to answer for. "Stay," she whispered. "I'm not leaving. I lied." People say death arrives with a shout, but often it is a quiet, almost polite guest. The mother exhaled long and low and did not inhale again. The room knew before any of us admitted it. The fire chose that moment to crack. The snow chose that moment to hush. The sister let go of her hand and pressed both palms to her own face, as if to keep herself from spilling out. The cousin began to keen the sound of old women and winter wind. Someone closed the mother's eyes and then opened them again, as if sight could be restarted like a stubborn lamp. Silence never lasts in a room like that. Panic comes to fill it because panic is easier than sorrow. Voices rose sharp, miserable, needing a target the way fire needs dry wood. The sister rounded on me with a face I recognized, only because it had moments ago been tender. "What did you do?" she demanded, which is a different question from "What happened?" A man I had not seen in the corner, brother cousin, grief under a cap, jabbed a finger at me like it was a knife he had been saving. "You brought this," he said. "You and your muttering, your herbs. Witches bleed women dry and feed the devil. Look what you've fed him." He pointed to the still child, the mother, who had turned to stone while we watched. There are answers that would soothe no one. I stood with my hands empty and useless. "She laboured too long," I said. "The cord." But cords and complications do not satisfy a house that needs a villain more than it needs a truth. Someone spat the word that had been waiting in their mouths unsaid for years, witch. It changed the temperature of the room. It always does. It pulls the heat into a corner and tells the cold to sit everywhere else. I gathered my basket because you learn in time that you survive by obeying the first good instinct. "I should go," I said, and that was consent enough for their story to start walking. The sister stepped aside as if I were a smoke she wished to avoid. The man shouldered past me to the door and threw it open, as if he meant to let God in. Snow rushed at us all. "Out," he said, and I went because nothing good lives in a room once a word like that has been spoken. Rumour is quicker than fever and harder to treat. By morning, I was no longer the girl who boiled water and stayed through the night. I was the woman who killed babies and drank mothers the way frost drinks rivers. I could feel the story spread by the way. Doors closed a breath sooner. By the way, greetings were replaced with the sudden necessity of looking at a cartwheel or a pig's ear. At the well, Someone made space for me. The way you make space for a wasp carefully, with a sort of reverence that is not admiration. Children were told not to stare. They stared. The boy with the healed leg limped again when I passed. The blacksmith hid his honey-slicked scar under a sleeve, as if covering the evidence could erase the origin. I waited for some counterweight, a hand on my shoulder, a word spoken aloud that said, "No, I saw her sit through the night. No, I remember the cough that stopped." But gratitude shrivels in fear's weather. Even the midwife from Albinon, my aunt, who had taught me to name plants by scent and pain by breath, did not appear at my door. Perhaps she was in another village. Perhaps she had learned long before me that survival is a private discipline. The summons came 2 days later, stamped with a seal that liked to pretend it was certainty. The church court would hear my case. They called it a case as if I were a plot of land boundaries to be surveyed. The priest did not bring it himself. He sent a boy, the same boy who had pounded on my door, now careful not to meet my eyes. I thanked him and shut the door before he could see me shake. The church has many rooms. The one they put me in for the hearing had a table ordinary enough to be a kitchen table, and benches ordinary enough to have held any number of ordinary sins. The ordinary is a comfort they arrange for themselves. The priest sat with 2 men in town cloaks. Their faces looked carved from the same wood. They asked me to swear to speak truth, and I did, because truth was the only thing I had carried that no one could steal from my basket. The questions were familiar, as if they had been waiting in a trunk and were glad for the fresh air. "Have you ever walked barefoot through snow and not died?" one asked Penn, already scratching. As if my answer would only decorate what he'd already written. "Many times," I said, "but I do not recommend it." He looked displeased by the shape of my truth. "Did you summon hail in the spring 2 years past?" If I had that kind of power, I said, too tired to be properly afraid, I would have learned how to bake bread for supper. One of the town men glanced up, either amused or annoyed. It is hard to tell the difference on faces that have been practicing severity since birth. "Do not mock the process," the priest murmured. "Then do not ask me to confess to weather," I said, soft enough that I could pretend I was speaking to my own hands. They asked about cats, lovers, knights. Had I lain with demons in the woods? Had I kissed a book I could not read? Had I rubbed ointments into the bark of trees to coax children from them? Had I spoken to women privately under cover of darkness? Yes, I said to the last and to the prize. First, in the sense that all the men in our village become devils after 3 cups of ale. The priest did not write that down. They asked if I had a mark on my body that did not bleed, proof of some pact. "Everything on this body bleeds," I said, and then wished I hadn't. The truth made me sound guilty of being alive. They wanted names, not reasons. "Who instructed you?" "My mother," I said, "and life." "Who are your accomplices?" "Anyone who has ever washed their hands before touching a fever and called it common sense." "You are evasive," the clerk said. "I am precise," I answered, and learned how precision sounds when it is read aloud by a man who disapproves of it. No one came to speak for me. The room had 1 small door. It remained stubbornly unused. I found myself counting breaths, mine, theirs, the room's, to keep from counting absences. I imagined the blacksmith's arm, and the boy's sleeping chest, and 100 small salvations that now sat like foolish birds with their heads tucked. Perhaps they had agreed all my little proofs to be silent together. Perhaps silence was their thanks to me, the only language they thought safe. They brought in the relative from the deathbed, the brother or cousin. Men blur in grief the way they blur in drink. He told the story the way stories prefer to be told, cleanly, with a villain who obligingly enters exactly when needed. He said I had muttered in a foreign tongue and laughed when the baby did not cry. I have never laughed near a dead child. I do not laugh easily near living ones. But a courtroom requires theatre. He performed, and the bench nodded, as if they had purchased tickets. When he finished, he looked at me the way men look at a door they have just locked. I spoke my small, stubborn version, the hours, the cord, the bowl of rags that would not stay full, the final exhale like a thread snapping. I did not mention the feel of the baby's cool shoulder against my palm. I did not think my hands could say it without shaking. The clerk scratched and scratched, shaping my words into something that would sit straight on a page, even if it could not stand up in the world. They asked me finally if I repented. The word felt like a trap disguised as a poultice. Repent of what? Of trying, of learning, of staying, until the end. I am sorry the child did not live, I said. I am sorry the mother died. I am sorry for the limits of my hands and the shape of the world. Not acceptable, the priest said, with the relief of a man returning to a road he knows. Repent of witchcraft. I cannot repent a word you have put into my mouth, I said, and tasted how close sorrow sits to anger. They conferred in low voices, designed to sound holy, and only achieved secrecy. Then they told me I would be held for further inquiry, a phrase as smooth as riverstone, and just as cold. We will pray with you. The priest promised the way. People promise blankets when they mean to remove the roof. I bowed because there was nothing else to do that did not involve breaking furniture. They led me to a small, mean cell, a room that had learned its work long ago. There was straw on the floor, the colour of old teeth. There was a window too high to be useful and a door too heavy to be argued with. I sat and held my hands in my lap and looked at them, at all the lives they had carried and all the blame they now must. I thought absurdly of my herb bed under the eave at home, and whether the time would remember to creep between the stones without me telling it to try. At some point in the dark, I laughed once because the other option was to shake. If I had truly the power to ruin crops with a thought surely, I would also know how to bake bread for supper and feed myself more than fear. If I could call hail, I would call rain properly on time and rest my head against a full barn. If I could walk barefoot through snow and not die, I would at least choose a better destination than this. No one heard me. No one was meant to. Night pressed in close and stank of damp, as all official nights do. I curled on the straw and listened to the building breathe, and tried not to think about how many women had lain here, practicing the same merciless arithmetic. How much of me can I afford to lose before I am no longer myself? Somewhere a bell marked the hour, with a sound that might have been mercy or only habit. I closed my eyes and asked my body for one more piece of obedient sleep, so that morning could arrive and the next hard thing could be born. Prison torture and forced betrayal. The prison had no interest in appearing dramatic. It did not need chains that gleamed or doors that boomed. It preferred the less expensive instruments cold that found your marrow hunger, that turned your thoughts into birds beating against the inside of your skull darkness, that did not so much fall as seep. They led me down a corridor that appeared intent on swallowing its own length past a window cut so high a saint would have needed a ladder to see mercy. The cell they chose for me had straw the colour of rotted teeth and a bucket that introduced itself first by smell and later by necessity. On the wall, someone had scratched a small cross with a nail or a bone. I touched it and felt nothing but grit. Whatever hope it had held for the last pair of hands had long since scabbed over. Night in a cell is not the opposite of day. It is the same thing, only colder and stitched with sounds that are not yours. the cough of an old man counting down his ribs, the animal sob of a woman who tries to muffle it with her skirt, the regular step of a guard who believes the floor must constantly be reminded who is heavier. I learned the noises of water as if they were a language, the drip that lied about time, the thin scrape of a ladle somewhere far away, the sudden shout when someone dropped a cup. When they brought me my portion, it was always late enough to prove a point and thin enough to make another. The broth wore the ghost of cabbage. The bread could have been used to patch a roof. Hunger finds a way to speak in your mouth, even when you are silent, a sourness that bleeds into every thought. Cold is its own catechism. The stones taught it to me each hour, insisting I memorize the lesson by bone. I wrapped my arms around myself until my shoulders learned the shape of my elbows. I blew into my hands and smelled fear, which has the same scent as iron and regret. When dawn pretended to be interested, a trickle of grey slid through the window and lay down on the straw, like a cat not yet convinced of you. I counted the slats of light, the flecks in them, the dust that rose when I shifted. Anything to keep my mind gathered, anything to keep the dark from telling me my own name in a voice that was not mine. The first questioning came before I had learned the size of the room by touch. They walked me through corridors that could have been the same corridor repeated past doors that had taught themselves the art of not caring. In the chamber, a table sat like a judge who had retired but refused to leave. They asked me to sit and then rose so that I would remember who had knees and who had the right to use them. The clerk dipped his pen as if baptizing it. The priest folded his hands, a ceremony he performed around every cruelty. The questions arrived as they always arrive, patient, as gnats determined as winter. How long had I served the devil? Had I flown to gatherings in the woods, which nipple on my body had no feeling? The one he fed from, I said, no, no, and that everything on my body feels when it is torn. They did not like the third answer, because it dared to be honest without permission. They asked whether I had snuffed candles with breath borrowed from hell, whether I had walked through snow without leaving prints. If I walked through snow without leaving prints, I said you would not have followed me here. The clerk wrote this down very quickly, not because it was clever, but because it could be made to look like insolence when unrolled for other eyes. They did not begin with iron. They began with absence. They let the broth come late, and the straw stay damp, and the bucket remained too close to sleep. They visited in the middle of the not night, and asked me to stand and repeat what I had already said in the not day, and when my voice cracked, they pretended not to hear. A man with a voice like a blunt knife told me that my aunt had already confessed. He told me my friends had named me. He told me the village was safer now that I was here, and wouldn't I like to be safer too, by agreeing with the better story. I told him stories are only better when they are true. He smiled a priest's smile without being a priest, and said we would teach my stubbornness to kneel. When they brought the iron, it did not announce itself like a villain in a ballad. It only waited on a table that had never learned tenderness. They tied my wrists to a chair and spoke to each other about bread prices and harvests, a kindness they extended to themselves, so the room would not have to carry the whole weight of what they were about to do. The first fingernail came off with the sound of a beetle being cracked between teeth. My body climbed itself and tried to flee. My voice left me out of pity. The second nail hesitated, and then remembered it did not belong to me. The third taught me that pain can be a map. It shows you exits that are not there. They wrapped cloth around my head and poured water until my mouth forgot its job and tried to breathe what cannot be breathed. They kept it just this side of drowning, the way a miser keeps a coin just this side of spending, proud of restraint. They told me to speak, and then did not allow air for speech. They asked me to answer, and then turned my answers into proof of the next question. They starved my body, and fed my fear, and called it inquiry. When they paused, the pause was worse. Your mind takes whatever space it is given and fills it with the worst thing it can remember. I tried at first to pray the way I had been taught as a child, words in a row like beads meant to make a rhythm. The rhythm faltered. My mind slid away from the old sentences and grabbed at the ones that had always steadied me. Names of plants, names of bones, the steps you take when a child is late to breathe, nettles, yarrow, willow, thyme, radius, ulna, clavicle. Warm the water strip, the child rub the chest, wait for the hitch, that means life has returned to consider us. The guards thought I was muttering spells. I was counting my way back to myself. Days blurred, or maybe there were only 2, and I gave them extra faces, so I would have more to endure, and thus more to survive. Confess, and you will eat, someone said. Confess, and you will sleep, another added. Confess, and you will go home, said the one who liked to make promises that required no witnesses. Home became a word with too many meanings. Which home? My mother's arms, my herb bed, the church steps, where I had learned to keep my face calm, or the other home, the one under the ground, where names do not matter, and pain is a rumour. The living insist on repeating. They brought in a woman to speak softly at me, as if kindness were a scalpel that could cut away resistance. She told me her sister had been stubborn, and that stubbornness had cost her more than agreement would have. She told me God loves a penitent heart, and the men in the next room love a penitent tongue even more. I asked her if she ever had a fever as a child, and whether someone had sat up with her to press cloth to her brow. She blinked as if I had spoken in a code that she almost remembered, then left without answering. The next morning, if morning it was, they took the rest of my nails. I watched them work as if my hands were a friend's hands, and my job was simply to bear witness so that later someone would know. I thought of the boy with the healed leg and the blacksmith's arm, and the way honey looks when it glazes a wound, ridiculous and holy. I thought of my mother's voice saying careful, and my aunt's voice saying guard it like a wound. I thought of the stillborn child, whose blue did not belong to any sky, and of the mother whose last breath left as politely as a guest who does not wish to wake the house. The room narrowed, the men's faces lengthened. I understood that truth and pain do not share a table for long. I no longer remembered my own name, only that they wanted me to say, I am a witch. The sentence appeared in my head like a rope thrown from a ship I did not wish to board. I said nothing, and they taught my silence a lesson. When the chair broke under my weight, they replaced it with another. When my voice refused to climb back into my mouth, they taught my body to speak without it. They hoisted me by the wrists until my shoulders opened like doors for thieves. They let me hang until my teeth sang. They called this helping me tell the truth, the way a farmer calls the slaughterhouse a necessary kindness. At some point, time is a stubborn liar. In a room where lamps are miserly, they offered the quill. Say the words the clerk suggested and sign, and we will see about mercy. I stared at the quill as if it were an animal whose habits I had forgotten. It made a small scratching sound against the paper, even before it had anything to write, like a throat clearing before telling a story it no longer believes. The priest recited what I was to confess, that I had flown to Sabbaths in the forest, that I had lain with demons who smelled of pitch and snow, that I had stirred storms, soured milk, pinched babies, so that their mothers would need me. I could have laughed, if laughter had not become an extravagant ornament I could no longer afford. I imagined the alternative, no confession, and the chamber returning to its usual industry, and my body breaking open in all the ways that cannot be stitched. I imagined my mother hearing that her daughter remained stubborn to the end. Stubborn is not a name you want on a grave. I imagined my aunt shaking her head, not in shame, but in recognition. She would know the cost of being right. She would know that the world enjoys a woman's correctness, least when it is most needed. So I said the sentence they wanted, and it felt like pushing a stone I would never be able to lift off again. I said that I had met in the woods at night, that I had kissed a book I could not read, that I had brewed herbs with intent not just to heal, but to harm. Each word tasted like dust taken from someone else's floor. When they asked for the name of the devil, I thought of 100 men with 100 cruelties, and could not pick one. I chose the first thing that would satisfy their spelling. The clerk nodded, as if a lid had finally found its jar. Then came the part I had feared, without letting myself look at it directly. Name the others, the priest said gently, as if asking me to pass bread. Your accomplices. Who taught you? Who attended the gatherings? Who hides behind your door when you pretend to be alone? I shook my head and felt the room tighten like a belt. They did not bother with iron this time. They only set the quill near my hand and waited, because waiting is another instrument. I tried bargaining with the air. Take me whole if you must, but let the names stay in me. Air is a poor partner. It does not sign contracts. It does not bother to wish you well. They reminded me again my aunt had already confessed, my friends had already named me. Lies perhaps, truths perhaps. In that room each sounded identical. The door in me that had stayed barred through pain cold, and hunger opened on its own, because grief knows how to pick locks pain cannot find. I said my aunt's name first. It left my mouth like a tooth I had kept too long. Then the names of women who had pressed water into my hands, who had taught me which weeds are generous and which are vain. Women who had allowed me to be useful before I had earned it. I said their names because I could not think of a world where my silence would actually save them. I said their names because I wanted the room to end. I said their names because a person can drown in air if it is administered correctly. When the last name sat on the page, the clerk sanded the ink and blew gently as if cooling soup for a child. I signed the death warrant of the very people who saved my life. The sentence fell out of me before anyone asked for it. No one wrote it down. Mercy in that room was a word with its sleeves rolled up. The priest placed his hand on my head, a parody that had forgotten it was a parody. He called it a blessing. The guard called it done. I called it what it was, the end of one kind of resisting and the beginning of another that had no dignity to recommend it. They took me back to the cell, and the straw remembered me with pricks and the bucket remembered me with smell. Somewhere down the corridor, a door sobbed in its hinges. I lay on my side and watched the window try to have a conversation with a sky that was busy elsewhere. I said my aunt's name again. This time, the way you say a blessing over bread, you are certain you do not deserve. I said the others one by one, and felt the room fill with them, or maybe with the absence of them, which is heavier. Hunger returned, as if it had only stepped out for air. Thirst sat with it. They are good companions. Cold settled its argument with my bones, and claimed the larger share. When the next day, or the same one pretending brought water, I drank greedily, and then hated myself for wanting anything. The guard said I had done well. I told him some people keep a pet and call it conscience. I no longer owned either. He did not understand and walked away safe inside the armour of not understanding. In the days that followed, the prison practiced its one art, making time indistinguishable. I slept in stitches and woke to the sound of someone counting blessings or curses. In that place, they can be sorted after. They let me keep my hands. The nails would not grow back in time to be useful. When I pressed my fingers to my mouth, I could taste iron and ink. The confession would be read aloud soon, they said. The names would be fetched. The world outside my cell had begun to move toward misery as efficiently as a mill turns grain to flour. I pictured the flour on my mother's table and the way she would brush it into a neat pile before drawing a cross through it with her knuckle. I wondered if she would do it that night. I wondered if she would forgive a daughter who had traded other women for one more hour without pain. When I slept, I dreamed of my herb bed, the thyme creeping between stones, the yarrow pretending to be a small son, the chamomile nodding like a kindly gossip. In the dream, my hands were clean and my nails whole. When I woke, my hands belonged to someone else. I tried to remember my own name and found it on the far side of too many doors. What remained was only the sentence I had learned to say, and the sentences I had been forced to ink, and the knowledge that neither would feed me. Somewhere I told myself, there is a version of this world where a woman can stay with a dying mother without being made into the cause. A version where names are kept like seeds in a pocket, not scattered on a stone floor for birds with iron beaks. I could not find that world in the straw, or the bucket, or the cold. I could only find breath, and then another, and then another. The poor person's riches, the debtor's currency with which we purchase the next minute. I counted them carefully, not because I thought they would add up to freedom, but because counting was the last arithmetic I knew that did not require me to subtract someone else. When the last ember gave up its colour, the crowd began to thin. The square remembered what it had been before, just wood and stone and silence. Somewhere a child laughed too soon. Somewhere else someone swore they had seen a shadow rise. But there was nothing left to see, only smoke and the faint perfume of something once alive. History likes to call these stories tragedies. I think they're mirrors. They show us not how cruel the world was, but how easily it can be cruel again. The Middle Ages were not made of devils and saints, but of people frightened, faithful, fragile, and still trying to make sense of the dark. That too is medieval life. So let the fire fade and let the night be kind. If the quiet of these stories helps you rest, if they make you wonder a little or breathe a little slower, then stay. There are more voices waiting in stone corridors, in frostbitten fields in hearts that refused to harden. Subscribe to Sleepless Historian and come back when the world feels too loud. We'll be here with more forgotten lives, more gentle histories, and more truth softly told by the fire.